Alrighty. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Dominguez with Cal Optima Health. And on behalf of the County of Orange, California, and our World Elder Abuse Awareness Day Committee, I want to welcome you all to the 2024 World Elder Abuse Awareness Day events. Next slide. As an overview, our webinar begins with our two guest speakers, Brett Chabot and Daniel Clift, who will discuss national trends in financial elder abuse and cybercrime and older adults. Their presentation will be followed by a question and answer period. We will then introduce our panelists who will be answering your questions on elder financial abuse from both a local and national perspective. We will then end today's event with closing remarks. We'll now get started with some housekeeping. Next slide. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to all attendees in case you would like to go back and reference any of our slides, resources, and other materials. You all have been muted by our webinar administrator, so we can avoid any unnecessary background noise. Your audio, how loud we sound to you, is controlled by you though. You can adjust your volume on whatever device you're watching us on. Note, the hand-raising feature has been disabled too, which leads me to our next agenda item, which is how to ask questions. Next slide. What we are seeing now is a screenshot of the Q&A box, otherwise known as a question and answer box. During your presentation, you will be able to type in questions for our presenters. We have committee members reviewing these throughout the presentation and will ask the questions of our speakers at the end of their presentation. Your question also might be responded to with some helpful information and links. Please remember not to wait until the end of the presentation to ask your questions, as we will be gathering these questions for the speakers throughout the presentation. Next slide. And today's continued education credits for today's events are provided compliments of Alzheimer's Orange County. Here are the basics for you, for those of you who wish to be certified for continued education credits for attending today's event. 1, you must attend the entire event from start to finish. 2, you must have access to both sound and visual elements of the presentation. 3, you must respond to the poll questions during the presentation. If you're unable to enter your answers to the poll questions for any reasons, please type your answers in the chat box instead so that you qualify for the CE certification. And finally, you must complete the course evaluation. When you leave the webinar, a window will automatically pop up to start the evaluation. So thank you again for joining us today. Now I will hand things over to today's moderator, Libby Anderson. Next slide.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that wonderful welcome. My name is Libby Anderson with the Council on Aging, and I have the pleasure of serving as the moderator for today's event. We'd like to thank Radiant Futures at the outset of today's event for sponsoring our opportunity drawing. If you participate in the evaluation following our webinar, you will be entered into an opportunity drawing to win a $250 gift card from Amazon. There will be a total of 20 winners. You must provide your age range when completing the evaluation in order to qualify for the opportunity drawing. Next slide, please. Now, before we get into our presentations for the day, I'd like to honor the history of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, otherwise known as WEAAD. WEAAD was launched on June 15, 2006 by the World Health Organization to promote a better understanding of elder abuse and to shine the light on the need to recognize and defeat elder abuse in all its forms: physical, emotional, psychological, sexual, financial, and neglect all around the world. In 2011, President Barack Obama issued the first official presidential proclamation naming June 15th National Elder Abuse Awareness Day. And not long after that, the governor of the state of California and the Orange County Board of Supervisors followed suit. WEAAD events have been happening for roughly a dozen years now. Attendance at WEAAD conferences has topped 400 over the years, and now there are 20 to 40 WEAAD events that happen annually around the United States and Canada and include events from numerous other countries as well. Our hope is for professionals and the community at large to become more aware of elder mistreatment and to empower older adults and the people who love and care for them. Next slide, please. I'd also like to honor the Planning Committee, which has been working for the past 9 months on today's event. Thank you all for your commitment, your time, and your energy. Next slide. And now I'll hand things off to Tracy Bell from Alzheimer's Orange County to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Libby. Next slide. Our first speaker is Brett Chabot. Brett has been a supervisory special agent since 2009 in the Financial Crimes Unit here in Orange County. He has 8 years of experience investigating complex financial crimes and served as a FBI legal attaché in Singapore for 3 years. Brett holds a Bachelor's of Science and a Master's of Accounting degree from the University of Wisconsin and has been a certified public accountant since 2004. Next slide, please. Then we'll hear from Daniel Clift. Daniel has been an FBI special agent since 2016 in the Complex Financial Crimes Squad, also in Orange County. He currently investigates cryptocurrency, money laundering, and fraud, and has also had previous experience in bank robbery and organized crime investigations. Prior to joining the FBI, Daniel was a police detective for 17 years with law enforcement experience. He holds a Master's of Science in Economic Crime Management and has been a certified fraud examiner since 2013. Next slide. Without further ado, I'll hand this off to Brett Chabot.
All right, thank you for that introduction, and good morning, everybody. As noted in the introduction, my name is Brett Chabot. I'm a supervisor here in the FBI's Orange County office, and I supervise a squad of about 10 agents, a couple of forensic accountants, and some tactical and intelligence analysts that focus solely on complex financial crimes. And as we'll get into here in the next couple of slides, you'll, I think, hopefully get a better understanding of why we have a squad of that many people dedicated just to what we would call complex financial crimes. And I would also make the argument, if my bosses were here listening, that is not nearly enough, given the size and prevalence of fraud, not just in the United States, but specifically here in Orange County, because of the size of the population here. So next slide, please. So a lot of what we do, which we'll cover here, and actually you can go to the next slide as well. But if you folks are familiar with American Greed, the TV show that used to be on TV, and I think it still is, they've done many different seasons, and that show would highlight a lot of fraudsters and con artists and scoundrels, as they would call them, that essentially would just try to raise money either via some sort of investment platform or a straight up scam, and then use those proceeds taken from the victims to enhance their own lifestyle and to live a lavish lifestyle well beyond their means. And unfortunately, there are thousands of those types of subjects throughout the United States. The FBI has 56 different field offices spread out throughout the country, and every single field office has a white collar crime squad, which may take kind of the same form that my squad does here in Orange County, which is an agent population of say 10 or 12 agents, and then forensic accountants, intelligence analysts, tactical support analysts that can kind of help us identify who these subjects are, collect evidence so we can enhance and build prosecutions down the road against these individuals. Some of our larger field offices, including here in Los Angeles, New York, Miami, and a few other places, have multiple white-collar crime squads. So as I had mentioned, Dan and I, and you'll meet Dan here in a second, we cover Orange County specifically. So if the subjects or victims are in Orange County, that's what gives us our venue or jurisdiction, and we work those cases. But in addition to that, we also have sister squads that work in the Inland Empire, obviously up in Los Angeles County, both down in Long Beach and up in our main office in downtown Los Angeles. And we have multiple squads there that focus on white collar crime. And some of them vary. They may focus on money laundering and bank fraud, and others will focus on these types of scams that we're about to talk about today, as well as the investment frauds, corporate frauds, insider trading, and that sort of thing. So with all of that said, I wanted to just kind of paint that as a backdrop, because you want to look at this next slide that we have right here. And this is reporting that's collected by the FBI's Internet Crime Complaint Center. For those of you who don't know what that is, it's referred to in short as IC3 or IC3.gov. And essentially what it is a platform or a reporting mechanism that's managed and run by the FBI in Washington, in DC, to collect complaints from victims, not just in the United States, but globally. So you don't have to be a US citizen, as an example, to go to IC3.gov to file a complaint. You can be a citizen anywhere in the world. In fact, the crime may not have any nexus to the United States. There's no kind of, there's no kind of setup on the front end of IC3 to determine whether or not a complaint should be filed there or in another jurisdiction. It's really, and the reason for that is ease of reporting. We want to make it as easy as possible for the victims to report the information to the FBI. So IC3.gov is a website all victims can go to, and they can file a complaint regarding any scam that they may have been victimized. And ultimately, it takes 10 to 15 minutes to fill this out. And this reporting will identify who the victim is, but more importantly, who the subject or who the victim believes the subject is, as well as where the money went, how much was sent, when it was sent, and what in general was the nature of the scam. In other words, if it was a tech support scam, or a romance scam, or a government impersonation scam, as an example. And we'll, in the next couple of slides, cover some of those scams that get reported significantly to IC3. But as a result of having this platform set up, IC3 is able to harvest and collect and generate reports every single year that show the amount of fraud that's reported to IC3.gov. And so that's what this slide is here that you're looking at right here. In 2019 through 2023, you can see the number of complaints that have been reported through this mechanism. And as you can see, the loss amounts and the number of complaints are mind-boggling, right? So we're looking at in 2023, as an example, 12.5 billion, for those of you that can't read that, that's billion, not million, in losses reported to IC3.gov. And that jumped up from 10.3 in 2022, up from 7 million in 2021, and so on. So that's that red line, which is the total loss amount as reported by the victim that's been accumulated in all the IC3 complaints submitted that year. And so the number of complaints also important, right? As you can see in 2023, 880,000 complaints. That means 880,000 different times somebody or multiple people accessed IC3 to submit a complaint. And again, these complaints are primarily scam, white collar crime related, sometimes in cyber incidents. We're not talking obviously about things that should be reported to local police departments if it's a homicide or a violent crime. This is primarily for white collar crimes and for cyber related incidents. And so you can see the size of the problem. And one thing I just want to highlight here that's very important for this slide is that this is just the folks who are reporting stuff. So I can imagine that there is a significant segment of the population that either doesn't know about IC3 or did not report their scam. Well, that obviously isn't captured in this slide, right? So this is, again, just what we know that has been reported through that mechanism. Next slide, please. Okay, and then the further reporting here by IC3 kind of breaks down the complaints by age group. As you can see, every single age group is affected by this. And also, as you can imagine, those over 60 seem to be affected the most, many times because it's intentionally targeting those folks for a variety of reasons that we can talk about later. So as you can see the breakdowns here, everybody is really prone to this, right? But the loss amounts in terms of, and again, this is just 2023, and it doesn't take in the type of scam. This is just complaints submitted by age group. And so we have victims over 60 that reported 101,000 of those complaints that came in 2023 for an estimated loss amount, or sorry, a reported loss amount of $3.4 billion. Next slide, please. And then we can get into the crime types that are reported to IC3. So this slide's a little small, and I apologize for that, but there's really just and it's kind of busy, but there's a couple of takeaways here that I wanted to highlight on, and that is the types of scams that are reported. And sorry, this is also a subset of complainants that were over 60 years old. So of those complainants or victims that were over 60 that reported to IC3 in 2023, this is the type of scam that they reported or fell victim to. And the number one most prevalent scam is what we call a tech support scam. 17,000 of those complaints that came in related to a tech support scam. And for those that are unfamiliar with a tech support scam, we will talk about that on the next slide. We have data breaches, which sometimes could just be a malicious link that you're clicked on your computer or that sort of thing. We're not going to focus as much on that because the next one is also of equal importance, and Dan has several slides that he will talk about related to this. But these are the confidence-based or romance scams, and roughly 6,700. And I think that number is going to be even higher in 2024. It's what that number in 2023 is higher than it was in 2022, and that is the trend that seems to be going forward. As we have a lot of overseas international criminal organizations that are using romance scams via legitimate internet websites like dating websites, as an example, to target individuals. And Dan will talk a lot more about this in detail in slides here in a little bit. But those are the two most prevalent scams that we see here on my squad in Orange County, are the tech support scams and then the confidence and romance scams. And we'll talk a lot more about those here in a second. Next slide, please. Okay, so just before we get into that, I wanted to describe a little bit about what Dan and I do. I had mentioned on previous slides how our squad is made up. We have 10 agents, forensic accountant, a couple of tactical support analysts, right? And that is our squad. And on our squad, we have roughly 120 cases. So keep that in. Remember, that is just in Orange County, right? So that is either we have several victims in Orange County, or we believe the subject resides in Orange County. And 120 cases spread out over 10 agents is, averages out to 12, right? But that's a lot of casework for case agents to handle, right? And those cases come in a variety of different forms. We have what we would call our kind of traditional investment fraud cases, which we'll talk a little bit about today. And basically what those are kind of, the Ponzi schemes that you've heard about in the news. They take all shapes and sizes. We see the big ones, like our New York office worked with Bernie Madoff back, 15 years ago. But there's also much smaller ones that might only be in the $1 million to $2 million range, but they usually involve some sort of representations made on paper by the subject promising guaranteed returns in a short period of time if the victim sends money. These are generally cases that the U.S. Attorney's Office likes, that are easier to prove because a lot of the representations, or misrepresentations, I should say, are on paper. So in addition to victim testimony, you can also rely on documents that underline the investment, that talk about, as a private placement memorandum, as an example, which kind of corroborate what the victim's going to say. And essentially, again, as I mentioned, they talk about guaranteed returns in a short period of time. And I think the key takeaway with that is that there is no way, nobody has a trick to beat the market. Otherwise, we'd all be rich, right? Nobody can guarantee returns 15% a month, 12% a month, whatever it is. It's just not possible. But you have scammers out there that are doing it, that are soliciting money, and unfortunately our victims are falling prey to this. And we have, I would say, probably half of the cases that we have on our squad relate to this. So for those of you who maybe haven't seen or been exposed to this yet, it is very prevalent. We see it quite often in folks who just believe that they have the answer to the stock market, as an example, and know how to beat it, and then try to solicit their skills and expertise to victims. And ultimately, what these cases ultimately lead to is the victim send money to the subject takes that money and misappropriates it for his own personal well-being. So that's a lion's share. I'm not going to go down every single one of these bullet points, but that a lion's share of what we work on our squad is in the investment fraud. We have a few corporate fraud cases, and then we do some embezzlement stuff too, where you may have a company here in Orange County where an employee embezzled from it, left the company, took a couple $1,000,000. We work several of those cases. And then the next two bullet points, which is really the focus of our presentation here today, which is the romance scams and the cryptocurrency fraud, and the one above that, which is the impersonation tech support scams. I will cover those on the next two slides before we turn it over to Dan here in a second. So next slide, please. Okay, so I had mentioned, like, what is a tech support scam for those that don't know what that is. And this is a recent example. The top sentence there is a recent example of what a victim sent in through our IC3 reporting mechanism that we had talked about on the first slide. And this is what the victim wrote in kind of the incident description summary portion of that IC3 complaint. And they said, I received an email about a charge I didn't authorize for a Norton 360 antivirus subscription. There was a phone number to call, so I called the number. Right. So this is what we would say unsolicited contact. You're going to hear Dan and I talk about that a lot today, and it's going to be one of our key takeaways at the end. Right. This is an unsolicited contact via email. This is the scammer reaching out to the victim, claiming to be Norton 360 antivirus, charge I didn't authorize. This is impersonation. This is scammer tech support. This is scammer tech support impersonating somebody. In this case, it happens to be Norton 360, trying to use a legitimate company to give the scammer some credibility. The victim, who probably has no relationship with a Norton 360 antivirus subscription whatsoever, other than this email that came in, calls the number, and that's immediately where the mistake has been made. Once that phone call has been made, the victim is now fallen right into the scammer's hands. And what usually happens next is the scammer purports that there's some sort of illicit charge on their account and they need to send money to make it go away. It sounds silly when I'm saying it, right? But as you notice from the previous slides, this happens significantly. We had two more of these come in this week. One of the main jobs I have here as a supervisor is to essentially act as intake, right? So we get walk-ins and complaints that come into FBI field. This is all throughout the country, and here in Orange County specifically. And 2 to 3 times a week, we'll have a walk-in where a victim will come in claiming that they fell victim to a tech support or impersonation scam. They sent money to an account directed by the scammer. Many times that money's overseas in a foreign jurisdiction. And then they're asking what the FBI can do to help. And so we had 2 of those this week, as you can see from the previous slides related to the IC3 numbers. This is a significant problem. This is just one small example of a tech support scam. The next paragraph below is what we would call government impersonation, which is also a significant problem. Someone claiming to be Border Patrol. So this is the government impersonation portion of it. This is the scammer, of course, who is now calling a victim saying they found a package of heroin. This is a legitimate example, by the way, taken from IC3. They found a package of heroin and cocaine with my information on it. They provided a name and badge number. Again, that seems to the victim to add some sort of credibility to the scam, even though it's all fake. I mean, we could make it up as we're sitting here today. They demanded money to make the charges go away, so the victim wired the money. Again, it sounds silly. Many of you on this call are probably asking, why would you send money on that? But believe it or not, and as we reference back to the IC3 slides previous, it's unbelievable how often that this happens, right? So this, again, back to also our number one takeaway is this is unsolicited contact, scammer calling, impersonating government, asking that they demand money or demanding money to make charges, arrest warrants go away. I think most of us know on this call, the government, regardless of agency, and I would say regardless of, in most countries, because a lot of the government impersonation stuff we get is not U.S. law enforcement agencies. Sometimes it could be Chinese law enforcement targeting an ethnic Chinese citizen here in the United States, as an example. Government law enforcement agencies never ask for money. And then, so that would be kind of tenet number 2 here. The first being, this is unsolicited contact, hang up the phone. The second is the government would never ask for money. And that's what we try to get in these outreach presentations. And when we talk to victims, is that we're not going to be asking for money. Unfortunately, the victim in this example did end up wiring $150,000 to a bank account in Hong Kong. Next slide, please. I won't spend too much time on this, and it's kind of a lengthy slide, but this is an example of a romance confidence scam involving cryptocurrency, which Dan's going to cover in much more detail here in a few slides. But this is, again, a word for word verbatim account of complaint that was submitted to us just a few weeks ago. And it starts with unsolicited contact with a friend that they met. In this case, it was a social media platform, Facebook. They claim to be from Singapore, but now they're living here. And they're building a relationship here. And Dan will cover a lot more of this, but you can see that she saw my profile and that my interests were photography and travel. And then they talk about how he had recently traveled to Africa. This is all part of the scam, all part of the game to just build confidence with the victim. They're not going to ask for money right away. They're becoming friends. But the person acting as Zoe Lynn here is the scammer, right? And she's part of an overseas criminal organization that is actively targeting U.S. citizens to try to get their money and have it sent either via U.S. dollar wire transfer to jurisdictions overseas or into cryptocurrency. Like I said, Dan will cover on that in a bit. So this is an example of confidence romance that we just received a few weeks ago. And I think what's alarming about this one is the amount of money that was sent. And there were many of these victims are sending over $1 million. They are leveraging assets that they have. They're taking out loans on homes that they have. They are borrowing from friends, family, and relatives to continue to send it to who they believe is a romantic interest that they met on Facebook, when in actuality, it's really a scammer. So next slide, please. And this is just one more example before I turn it over to Dan. This is another example of the tech support. And as you can see, victim here, this is, again, a real life example just reported to us a few weeks ago. Computer froze up, pop-up comes up. Here's a phone number to call, okay? We can stop right there. You don't even have to read the rest of the slide. Giant red flag here, unsolicited contact. Here's a phone number to call. Don't call the number. It's a scammer, right? That's the key takeaway on the slide. Everything after this is just the scammer adding in lies to enhance their credibility, right? And then, of course, the sad part of this about this slide is the very last sentence, where ultimately the victim fell prey to it and wire transferred $57,000 from their IRA to another account that was directed by the scammer. One just note of interest on here, you'll see in the middle of this slide, Steven Gruber was the name that the scammer was using, or at least one of the scammers was using. We can, through the IC3 reporting mechanism, it's a very good search tool for us. So when we get victim complaints, a lot of times we will get a complaint like this, and we'll run the phone number. We'll run the name Mark Ray that's in here. We'll run the name Steven Gruber, Principal Financial, any bank accounts that they may give us as well that the victim sent money to. We'll run it in IC3 because it's a searchable database, right? And we can figure out, okay, how many other victims have filed a complaint against Steven Gruber, as an example. And we did so in this instance. And what we had found was there was a collection of about 20, in this case, 24 victims spread out throughout the United States, all over the age of 60, who had sent money, who had been contacted via this tech support scam by a group of people, including Steven Gruber, because that was our search term, that collectively had sent about $14.6 million. In this case, most of the money went to Hong Kong or to an account in Vietnam. And that's what makes our job pretty difficult at that point is, obviously, this is a sophisticated scam network overseas, people acting as Max Miller, acting as Steven Gruber, Principal Financial, but they're really good at what they do. They had 24 victims, 14.6 million in losses that were sent overseas. And that's where our job is hard, because the money went to Hong Kong and it went to Vietnam. And while we have embassies there, or consulates in the case of Hong Kong, it doesn't mean we have the authority to go over there and just start freezing bank accounts. And so that's what makes our job really difficult. Is a lot of times by the time this is reported, the money's already moved out of the account that it was sent to. But even in lucky circumstances where it might still be in the account that it was sent to, we're at the mercy of a foreign jurisdiction, right, to convince them that this is scam money and they need to return it. And some countries, depending on where it goes, they just, because of the geopolitical environment, they may not pay attention to it. There's other things that they care about, or they don't care at all, and they don't want to cooperate with the United States. And so that's what is a major obstacle that we run into. So I believe that's my last slide. We might have a poll coming up here. I can't remember. Next slide, please.
We do. We are now on our first poll question. Unsolicited contact, whether through social media or by email, phone, or in person, communication is a red flag for fraud. True or false? So go ahead and enter your poll question quickly. If for some reason you're not able to, please enter it into the chat box. But again, unsolicited contact, whether through social media or by email, phone, or in-person communication, is a red flag for fraud. Just a couple more seconds. Okay, we'll go ahead and end the poll. Great job, everybody. And I will now hand it back to our presentation.
All right, thank you. I think I'll turn it over to Dan here now to go into the next topic here. Thank you.
Hey, hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. So we're going to talk about cryptocurrency fraud and laundering. And why is this such an important topic when we're talking about targeting the older population? This has become pretty much the number one tactic that we see to facilitate our elder frauds. Now, in some cases, you may be thinking, but I'm familiar with cases where individuals will wire money or they'll send cash. But what we're seeing on the back end is that those funds are then being converted to cryptocurrency so they can be more rapidly transferred into foreign jurisdictions. Banks have become pretty scrupulous now with analyzing and identifying suspicious overseas wires. They're more likely to put holds on them, question the individual that's facilitating the wire transfer. And so the popularity of cryptocurrency and the ease of accessing it now have become one of the main methods that our criminal actors are using to transfer funds. So just a couple examples here. We have business email compromise. That's actually on the downward trend a little bit, in my opinion, thanks in part to our ability to stop wire transfers a few days after they happen. For those of you who aren't familiar with business email compromise, that would be, for example, you receive an email, or one of your clients receives an email from, say, the broker that hosts their retirement account, instructing them to move their money to another account for some urgent reason. But it appears to be a legitimate email, and they follow the instructions and they send their funds to, a nefarious actor somewhere else. We often see these with our local businesses, but we also see them with individuals. Brett mentioned the government impersonation scams, police impersonation scams. This is where someone is impersonating a law enforcement officer. They may call and state that they're from the IRS, Homeland Security, Customs and Border Protection, FBI, etc. Usually it's a federal agency saying that they have a warrant for their arrest or a court appearance, and they have to pay a fee to avoid this or have it dismissed. Folks have been coached into actually going to local Bitcoin ATMs, buying Bitcoin with cash, and then transferring it. And we'll show you what happens on the backside of that. We want to stress that, as Brett said, law enforcement isn't going to contact you legitimately and request you to send money, specifically in the form of gift cards or cryptocurrency. So, we always instruct people to just hang up the phone. Now, one of the more troubling trends we've also seen, though, are people showing up at their homes to try to collect this money or even impersonating a law enforcement officer in person. That's usually a courier or money mule has been recruited to do that. It's not actually the scammer behind the scenes. But nonetheless, if that happens, people should call 911 immediately, and our local partners have done a great job coming out and addressing those when they happen. Finally, the first one we identify here is investment fraud, which we're going to get into more detail here in a second, because that's become, as far as losses go, the biggest problem that's facing our squads and the FBI in general. Go ahead, go to the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to get into a crypto laundering example here to show you kind of what happens behind the curtains, hopefully to convince you all that avoidance in the first place is by far our best weapon to combat these crimes. So in this example, one of our local subjects was participating in a fraud by taking cash and some wire transfers from victims, getting them into his bank account. He had a faulty company that he was using as cover. He then transferred his funds by way of a local crypto dealer to purchase some Bitcoin, and then help transfer them to our overseas scammers that were behind this. So go ahead and click the slide. So here's what the chart looked like after we traced what happened to that Bitcoin. Go ahead, click it again, please. One more time. So without getting into the real technical explanation of how crypto laundering works, these are some of the laundering techniques that are used. We have splitting, where they'll take a large amount of crypto from several victims, and then they'll split them off into several different digital wallets. Peel chain are just rapid transfers across different wallets, while smaller amounts peel off into exchanges. Now, if it sounds like I'm speaking another language to you all, my goal here is not to make you blockchain experts, but just to show you how complex this can get, and it can be done very quickly. This peel chain, this long string of transfers, and I know it's kind of hard to see, and I apologize for that. This was facilitated in about 90 seconds. If you have the proper wallet and computer software already set up in place, this can be done very rapidly. And mind you, this report's not hitting my desk usually for a couple of weeks or even longer, until the individuals realize they've been scammed, or by the time they go through reporting it, maybe they start with local law enforcement, go to ic3.gov, it gets triaged by Brett, and then it gets assigned out. This has already long happened. Go ahead and click the slide one more time, please. And I think we have one more graphic on here. So just to sort of show you the example, this is why recovering these funds gets so difficult and challenging. Next slide. Okay, so now this is a nice segue into our fastest, most scalable fraud that we're facing right now, which is called pig butchering fraud. Now, if you don't know what this is, I would encourage you all to take some time to Google it and do some research. Just make sure you type pig butchering fraud. Otherwise, you'll just find information on how we get our pork products. But what is pig butchering fraud? We give hours-long presentations on this type of scam alone, but I'm going to try to sum it up here in the interest of time. It's a sophisticated scheme where an individual is directed to open some sort of trading account on a digital platform, which is accessed through a website or a mobile app that is downloaded to your phone. Now, the scheme begins with unsolicited contact, usually through a dating website, a social media website such as Facebook or LinkedIn, or through unsolicited text messages. And that last one is the most common one we see when targeting the elder population. In the case of the text messages, the victim will receive a message on their phone that appears to be sent to the wrong number. Like, for example, somebody may send me a message that says, "Hey, Steve, when do you leave for your trip?" Only it's not really, sent to Steve, sent to me, as if it was accidentally sent to me. Now, the receiver will often reply, "Hey, sorry, you have the wrong number," but the scammer continues texting them with friendly messages, and they proceed to carry on a conversation and build a relationship this way. And it's actually been quite successful. Eventually, the scammer will share photographs of themselves. They're almost always successful, attractive-looking people of the opposite sex. Even though not all of our cases are romance-based, many of them have now just become more professional, or just, hey, let's just be friends. But nonetheless, they always seem to be attractive, successful people. For some reason, that personifies trust, I guess. Once they feel that their relationship has been established, They'll explain that a major source of their wealth was obtained through a unique investment platform that they used, and they'll suggest that the victim try it. Now, many of our victims are skeptical at first, but ultimately they'll encourage them, hey, why don't you just try a small amount of money, just invest a small amount, or I'll loan some money to your account. And irregardless, they convince the victim to try it. They text them step-by-step instructions on how to open their account, whether it's accessing a web link or downloading a mobile app to their phone through a link that the scammer sends directly, and then how to fund their investment account and make investments. And of course, in many of these cases, they're using cryptocurrency, or they're instructing them to wire funds to a bank account, and then those funds are getting converted to cryptocurrency. Another variation is that the investment itself is some sort of crypto, options trading contract. But irregardless, their accounts start showing immediate returns. The balances swell, and our victims believe, hey, I'm making money, and this is really easy. Go ahead and click the next slide, please. These scams always happen over a period of time, and after the victims send their money, the balance in a trading account immediately updates with the funds that they sent, whether it was cryptocurrency or wire transfer from their bank account. They, at the behest of the advice of their scammer that they're talking to, usually on a daily basis, they start making trades within these accounts, and they believe that they're making legitimate, income, when in reality their funds have been stolen the second they sent them, and the entire trading account itself is just entirely fictitious. Next slide. Here are just some quick examples of some trading websites that we've investigated in actual cases. Just want you to pay attention to how legitimate they look. Click again on the slide, please. You may have to click twice. Okay. Notice the obscure web addresses. Now, again, the links are sent directly to our victims through their text message conversations. Sometimes our websites will mimic legitimate websites or companies, so a Google search, would actually add some validation. But again, the scammer ensures that the victim uses the link they sent them directly. How often do we actually examine the site that we're on after we click a link that we believe is legitimate? Did you notice these obscure web addresses before we highlighted them? Next slide, please. And here are some examples of some mobile applications that were downloaded by some of our victims. Again, we've had individuals that were not very computer savvy, had never touched cryptocurrency, yet the scammers were able to walk them through step by step how to get on these platforms and start investing with them. And they would convince our victims that, hey, this is more lucrative than the stock market, and don't you want to have more money for your grandkids? You can send them to any school you want. And they've actually successfully got folks that are not very tech savvy to believe in this and to literally empty out their savings. Go ahead and click once on the slide. So this icon here is BBV coin. It's nestled between two legitimate cryptocurrency exchanges. We believe that this was mimicking BBVA, which is a company based in Turkey that provides legitimate access to digital assets. Next slide. So most of the investments involve some complicated type of crypto investment or short-term investment options contracts, spot gold contracts. Irregardless, there are always some sort of a complicated explanation to get by design. So our victims don't quite understand, or they don't think they're smart enough to understand how they're making money, and they just sort of trust the person that they've been talking to. Now, a lot of people will say, hey, I'll never fall for this, but think of how many people that we may know that lack relationships that would offer daily interaction. Then suddenly some kind person starts sending regular text messages, checking in on them every single day. Initially they're not even asking for anything in return. These scammers often have an excuse of their own that they also need to meet people, such as, hey, I just moved to the city that I'm in, or I just moved here from another country. I have a demanding job. I don't get out much. And they'll send daily text messages, and they'll be very patient about building these long distance relationships. Next slide. So let's talk about some of the red flags. we've interviewed literally hundreds of victims of this type of fraud. And in every single case, they've said, in hindsight, there are a lot of red flags that I ignored, mostly the result of this relationship that they built with this stranger. So just to sort of reiterate some of these, um, number one, we have impossible investment returns. We've had folks tell us, yeah, I was earning 200% a month return on my account. That's mathematically impossible. Doubling your money on a regular basis is just simply fantasy. Remember, the investment advice all along is coming from a stranger that you only know through text messaging. Now, some folks feel like, hey, I know I really know this person. We've talked, we've shared a lot about ourselves. But if you haven't really met them in person, I still consider them to be a stranger unless they're there for you to verify who they are and what they're telling you. And then finally, if you can name a legitimate US-based hedge fund that requires cryptocurrency transfers to fund to private wallets to fund your account, or wire transfers to obscure places in Hong Kong, Brett will buy you a steak dinner. Next slide. So I want to mention that these are criminal enterprises that are facilitating these scams. Many of our reporting victims will say, hey, just find the guy or gal who scammed me. It's, find where my money is. But as you can see here, it's much more complicated than that. So this is what's really behind the curtain on these operations. And there are hundreds of people involved, if not more, in each facet of this. I could spend 40 minutes just diving into what you're seeing on this slide alone, but here we just want to give you a snapshot. By the way, this information we're giving you is not just for you folks who have been gracious with your time today. It's for anybody who you know. So please tell your friends, your family, clients about this stuff. Get the word out. We need the awareness to spread faster than the fraud, because we're basically up against a cartel. Only instead of drug trafficking, they're facilitating fraud. So as this slide shows, we have a digital infrastructure. There are actual compounds where the individuals that are talking to the victims sit and work every day, oftentimes against their will. We have the laundering infrastructure, and then we have this character, this bad guy that we all assume is behind all this. There is some intelligence reporting on who's at the top of this food chain that unfortunately we can't get into in this setting, but they're believed to be billionaire gangsters out in Asia. Next slide, please. All right, so here's another case example of crypto laundering. So a victim came to us. They were convinced to invest 2.4 million in Bitcoin using an app that they downloaded from someone that they had met. They liquidated their home, their retirement account, and this was an individual that was already retired. Their account quickly gained returns. The balance exceeded $12 million. Once they realized that this was all a fraud, about 4 months after their initial transfer, they came to us and said, hey, well, I sent all my Bitcoin to one wallet, so you should be able to recover it pretty quickly, right? Click the slide again, please. So here's what happened after they sent to that one wallet. It went through this network of wallets, and we did identify what we call the first endpoint. Click the slide again. And one more click. So we have our network of wallets that were used to launder the Bitcoin, and then we have our first endpoint. Next slide. Unfortunately, that wasn't the end. That endpoint, this is the pattern we see in almost every case, is just a way to take the Bitcoin and swap it for another asset and then launder it even further through a whole other network of money mules. Probably have to click this about 4 times to bring the graphics up. So all this just to basically say and can convey to all of you that this is very complicated. Now, we have had some success in recovering funds, freezing accounts, but I mean, this is hours and days worth of work, and we're chasing a digital asset that's being transferred electronically months ago, and we're trying to reconstruct it manually. Click the slide again. All right, here's another case example. Just an example of how we're attacking this fraud. You may have to click this one like 10 times to bring everything up. So we had victims reporting through IC3 that they had transferred funds to payment processors in Los Angeles in the area. So we had victims in Orange County. They were sending their money to these faulty shell companies in LA. So of course we moved on this. We served search warrants at the residences, and we actually got a whole lot of information out of it, and we were able to really develop the case. The reason I'm showing you all this is because I don't want you to just think that this is all doom and gloom. There's nothing to be done about this. We are attacking these the best we can, as well as our partners, including Homeland Security, the Secret Service, some of our local partners. Unfortunately, there's just so many actors and so much involved in all of this that the only way we're going to get in front of it is through prevention and awareness, which is why we're all here today. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to wrap this portion of the presentation up with just hitting you guys again with some recent numbers, specifically on our investment fraud problem. Click the slide 2 more times, I think. I apologize for that floating red box. I should have been highlighting the crypto investment portion, but just to sort of drive home that, you know, cryptocurrency-related investment fraud rose over $2.5 billion in 2022, between 2022 and 2023. This is an increase of about 53%. Loss-wise, you know, this is our biggest problem. Now, the table that Brett showed earlier had tech scams listed at the top, and frequency-wise, those are the most frequently occurring. But when it comes to individual losses, it's these crypto investment frauds, these pig butchering frauds that are hitting people the hardest and really emptying out retirement accounts, pushing them to liquidate assets. We've seen homes, stock market trading accounts that are liquidated to invest in these platforms. Some may try to write it off and say, well, they're just being greedy. They just want to make more money. But when we sit down and talk to our victims, especially our older folks, you know, they're often telling us like, hey, I'd worked hard my whole life and I was going to make all this money and I was going to be able to send my grandkids to whatever school they wanted. I was going to be able to buy my kids a house in this very expensive state we live in. There was a lot of sort of, you know, very positive plans that they had to do with all this money that they thought they were making, when in reality they were just being, you know, cleaned out. Next slide. All right, I'm going to hand this back over to Brett. He's going to talk about some other aspects of our work as we wrap this up.
Thank you, Dan. That was great. And I know we are on our 5-minute reminder, and we have probably less than that now, so I will make this quick. But I really wanted to highlight one thing that Dan said at the end there, which is he had mentioned the losses reported related to the crypto and romance scams are much more significant than the tech support scams. And the truth lies there in like the previous slides. We don't have to go back to it, but if you recall, the one victim who was solicited via a romance scam, in the example provided to IC3, had lost 1.3 million, and the tech support victim who was contacted, I forget if it was Norton or whichever one it was, lost 57,000. And that's where the difference is. These tech support folks hit victims for what is still a substantial amount of money to them, but it's usually in the somewhere between $30,000 and $100,000, where the crypto and romance stuff that Dan has just briefed many times hits victims for well over $1 million. And that's why the loss amounts for those are so significant. So with all that said, I think we'll just wrap up here. With you can actually advance through the next 2 slides, please. Obviously, our primary goal is to prosecute individuals responsible for this, right? We also try to do cash seizures, bank account freezes. We seize big assets like houses and cars and boats where we can. But in these tech support scams and in the crypto and romance scams, those are very difficult because, again, as Dan noted, and we had alluded to in previous slides, the money's almost always going overseas, which makes asset forfeiture much more difficult. And so with that, I think we'll wrap up with this last slide, which is just to say no to any sort of investment or unsolicited contact or advice from anybody. You all have worked so hard to obtain the money that you have, the nest eggs that you've developed, and now you have to use the same amount of ambition and due diligence to hoard those assets and to keep them for yourself and your family, and not to give them away to strangers. And like Dan had said, please get this word out to friends, family, coworkers, whoever it might be, especially if you know that they've been maybe targeted in the past via a scam, because it almost always is a scam. And I think that is the takeaway here, regardless of what it is, tech support, government impersonation, crypto-based romance scam. It always starts with an unsolicited contact, and that's what we just have to say no to, and that's what we're trying to get out to our victims. Is it is always going to be nefarious unless you know the person, unless it's a family member and they're reaching out to you via text, via email, or via phone call. Hang up the phone. Don't answer the text. Don't answer the email. Please don't click on any links in text or emails. Just do not respond, and the scammers will move on to the next target. So with that, I think we're wrapped up. I don't know if we have a poll or we're turning it back over, but thank you.
Yes, we now have our next poll. It is okay to take investment advice from a friend. So again, true or false, go ahead and quickly answer. If you're not able to put your answer via the poll, please do put your answer into the chat. It is okay to take investment advice from a friend, true or false? Just give it a couple more minutes so everybody has, or I'm sorry, a couple more seconds so everybody has a chance to answer. Okay. It looks like people are split down on that one. So we'll go ahead and discuss that in the Q&A, but now I'll be handing things over to Laura, who will begin our Q&A.
Thank you, Lauren. We will now take questions for Brett and Daniel. And as a reminder, questions and comments can be typed into the Q&A box seen on your control panel. So the first question I have is what is the reason for the jump in complaint numbers from 2019 to 2020?
Yeah, I can make a pretty educated guess, although I can't say with 100% certainty this is the this is the answer. But I think it's really due to what was happening in the world, right? That is right when COVID-19 broke out. A lot more people were spending time inside, indoors, not going to work, working from home, spending a lot more time in front of screens, right? And as we've mentioned, most of these scams start in front of screens. So I would say that that is a significant prime and probably the primary reason for that jump in numbers.
Okay, and the next question is it okay to report attempted scams on ic3.gov if the scammer got access to a crypto account but was not successful in removing the funds, or should the potential target only use this website if there is a loss?
There does not have to be a loss. In fact, we get IC3 complaints routinely that have no loss, but it's an attempted scam, and that's still fine. So the short answer is yes. Please do report that, because it may cross-reference into an existing investigation that we already have ongoing. So it could help our investigators. And even if it does not, the more reporting we get into the IC3 website, the better it will help us in the future if we do end up opening cases against these criminal networks, or as Dan referred to, they're essentially cartels, right? So the more intel we have, the better, even if the scam was ineffective.
Okay, great. And what type of scams should a person be on the lookout if they are living in an assisted living facility?
All of them.
Okay, good to know. The next question is, this person was scammed and told to report to the police, but nothing has happened.
Yeah, so Brett, I'm going to chime in real quick on that one. There's, I had a whole spiel in our presentation, but I had to cut it out, unfortunately, because we are short on time. But one of the big complaints that we've seen, even publicly from a certain prosecutor who works up north for another county, that the FBI doesn't do enough. IC3 or it's just a data collection place. Nothing really comes of it. That's not really true. Yes, IC3 is used for data collection, but one of the misconceptions is, hey, I'm going to make this report, and then I'm going to get an investigator who's just going to sit there and work my case, try to recover my money, and just help me. Unfortunately, as you saw the numbers, there's not enough of us to give the personalized attention that we would like to. So as a, bureaucratic federal law enforcement agency, our mission is really to sort of cut the head off the snake, so to speak, to disrupt the organization, the criminal syndicate that's behind this, the best we can, and although that takes time, it's tedious, and it doesn't happen overnight. Our focus is to take a large swath of the information and attack the organization. So that means, victims may not always be hearing from us. We don't even talk to every victim. In fact, most of them we don't. We take the IC3 report. We work with the information that's on there. Oftentimes, I'll sit down with a victim. It'll be an hour or two interview, and we want to give them that attention, and we want to let them know that yes, we care, and yes, we're going to do everything we can. But I could spend 12 hours a day just interviewing victims and have a nice compile of reports, or I can spend the majority of that time doing the investigation, which is really the most challenging and time-consuming portion. So in some cases, the cases don't get investigated. We just don't have the resources. It's smaller than the other ones, and that's unfortunate. It doesn't mean we don't care. It just means we don't have the resources. But then I also want to throw out there that in many cases you're going to report, and you may not hear anything, but it doesn't mean that your case hasn't been lumped in with some ongoing, enterprise level investigation.
Okay, thank you. And how often do cases of financial abuse get prosecuted?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have specific numbers for that. I mean, I would say that it's certainly a priority, not just for us, but also the U.S. Attorney's Office. But similar to us, the U.S. Attorney's Office is also limited in resources as well, right? So, as background, like Dan and I work cases as investigators. We ultimately then collect all the evidence, bring it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and pitch that case to a line assistant U.S. attorney for possible prosecution. Ultimately, a decision is made on whether or not to move forward. So, what's problematic with these cases that we've run into is that because of the limited resources at the prosecutorial level as well, it's hard to spend a lot of resources chasing subjects that are unknown, that are overseas. So if we go back to some of the scams that we talked about previous here, on some of these slides, there was an individual who was claiming to be Steven Gruber. Okay, well, it's pretty much easy to prove that the victim was victimized. Steven Gruber called complaining to be, purporting to be with Norton Antivirus. Well, obviously that's not the case, and the victim's testimony could make that point in court. But the next step and the bigger leap that Dan and I have to spend investigating is, who is Steven Gruber and where is he? And oh, by the way, what we normally learn is that's obviously not Steven Gruber's real name. He's actually got a name in a Chinese name. He lives in China, and then we have to cooperate. The next step in theory would be then to try to cooperate with Chinese law enforcement to identify who this is. Well, unfortunately, because of the geopolitical environment, that's not going to happen. China's not going to tell us who that person is behind that computer screen, which we've traced to an IP address. So then we kind of run into a lot of roadblocks there. So unfortunately, the answer to that question is lower than we would want without giving you the exact number. If the targets are all here domestic and inside the United States, it's much easier, and it's a priority for us and for the U.S. Attorney's Office. But when we're start dealing with these cartels overseas and we can't identify who the actual scammer is, it's a much harder argument to make to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and also for ourselves, right? Because we don't even have the name of the subject. So how do we even know who we're trying to prosecute? We just have a name that a scammer used and an IP address, right? And then we run into the brick walls that are thrown up by foreign governments. So short answer, I guess, is if all of the targets are here and the money's here, then chances for prosecution are very high. If any part of it goes overseas, especially the money and the scammers are overseas, it's much, much lower.
The next question is, when would I report to the Federal Trade Commission and why?
I guess take a stab at that with a very general answer, which is the more folks you report a scam to, the better off you are in that you may get a response or catch somebody's attention. I can't speak with specifics as to what the FTC does when they get complaints, right? How closely they dig into them. So sorry to answer that very generically, and that the more you report it to, the better. And I would say, like, if you want to report it to the FTC, that's fine. Please report it to IC3, because, like we've said, even though you may not get a call back from an agent for a further interview, every single IC3 complaint that goes through FBI headquarters in DC is reviewed by a role called a management and program analyst. They review them all, and then they ultimately send them to the field based on the victim location. And the field, that first line is me as the supervisor, right? And then we have to figure out what to do next with it. So IC3 definitely. If I just can't speak with specifics as to what FTC does, but the more reports you file, probably the better off you are.
Okay, and then the next question is, what is the National Fraud Hotline?
Well, I'm familiar with the FBI's kind of public access line, which is 1-800-CALL-FBI. I don't know if we're referring to that or to something else. But the FBI has a hotline where you can call and speak with somebody on the East Coast to file a complaint. So this would be in addition to or in place of an IC3 complaint. If you actually want to speak to somebody who works for the FBI, you can call 1-800-CALL-FBI, and you can lodge a complaint with them. They will write up a report very similar to IC3. They will write up that report and then send it to the corresponding field office based on the victim location.
Okay, and what measures do banks have in place for large sums of money transfers? Can some measures be in place, be placed with verification needed by a family member, and especially for overseas transfers?
Well, I can answer based on experience. I don't want to speak for the bank specifically, but I do know that the banks focus on high-risk jurisdictions, right? So some of those include Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, many different countries in Asia, including other countries where a lot of IC3 complaints are indicate money is sent to, right? Which can also include Mexico and other countries at times. So banks will flag countries as high risk jurisdictions, but then it's up to each individual bank at that point to determine how they want to proceed. What we've seen from experience is that many times the banks are very good at bringing in the customer or calling the customer to make second contact after, as an example, a request for wire transfer has been submitted, say, to Hong Kong. They will call the victim and ask, hey, are you sure you want to do this, right? And they will ask the victim what the nature of the transfer is, why they're sending it. So it is kind of a decent first line of defense. But I've also seen from experience that many times the banks will defer to the victim, right? Because the victim, after all, is the customer. And if the customer is adamant that they send the money to Hong Kong because they had contact with a love interest on Facebook, then the bank's going to allow the transfer to go through, right? I would love to see a stronger first line of defense, especially with high risk jurisdictions where the transfers immediately just stopped, right? Rather than allowing the victim to kind of communicate with the bank that they do want to do this, because we do see more often than not, again, the victim has been scammed, right? They are in full belief that the person that they're speaking to is a romantic love interest. So they're going to, regardless of second questioning from the bank, they're going to say, no, I want this wire transfer to go through, because they don't know it's a scam yet. So I don't know if that answers the question. Like, the banks do some secondary questioning, right? Which sometimes can help hold up wire transfers. I just wish it was more, more successful, because obviously, as you can see from the IC3 numbers, there's still too much money leaving victims' accounts.
So, how do we find IC3 if we want to make a report? Is there a website we go to?
Yeah, it's ic3.gov. So the letter I for India, C for Charlie, number 3.gov. And then once you're there, it's pretty self-explanatory in terms of, like, should be a button for file a complaint, and then it'll walk you through what you need to fill out the complaint, we need at least the name and contact information for a victim. Most important when filing out those complaints is where the money went to. And if it's cryptocurrency, as you noted from Dan's presentation, we would need the wallet address, because that will help us identify, at least if that wallet is referenced in an existing investigation, where that wallet might be. We have some pretty effective cryptocurrency tracers in the FBI that can at least figure out where the money was sent to, if it's held at a US-based cryptocurrency exchange, as an example, or perhaps an overseas exchange.
Okay. We have a question here. When we get one of those texts that are, "Hey Joe, I forgot my shoes in your car," or something along those lines, and we click on that report junk, when we click on that, does that go to a specific reporting agency, or should we still report the number to ic3.gov as well?
When you hit report junk, that goes back to your cell provider. That does not come to law enforcement. So yeah, you would also want to follow that up and report that to ic3.gov as well. But that is a good first step. I do the same when I get those unsolicited contacts. We actually get them on our government work phone, which is crazy. So I still get ones to my FBI phone asking me, like, if I if I left my shoes in the locker at the YMCA, as an example, right? You just wanted to hit delete report junk, but that does not come to law enforcement. So you could follow up with an IC3 complaint as well.
Okay, so thank you. What the next question is, how is IC3 also getting the word out?
Well, IC3 is a reporting mechanism and collection data point. They don't do any like getting the word out or outreach. That is really the responsibility of each individual FBI field office, at least to the extent that the FBI is involved. And so that's where Dan and I come in here for Orange County. So IC3, in terms of pushing information out that they receive, so if they get as an example, in fact, I'm sitting at my desk right now at work and I have one of these in my inbox. IC3 received a complaint this morning from a victim in Huntington Beach who lost $827,000. That complaint was filed yesterday. It's now sitting on my desk this morning for possible action. So IC3 receives the complaints and they respond appropriately within 24 hours, but they respond internally to the FBI. So they're not going to reach back out to the victim. I don't know. Hopefully that answers the question.
Hopefully it does. The next question is, what is the percentage of individuals who recover their funds in the scams you described?
Less than 1%. And the reason for that is the scams that we've described, again, whether it's the tech support scams or the confidence romance-based scams, almost all of the time the money's going overseas. And as we've discussed, some of the challenges that we have in getting money. So it's certainly not for a lack of want or desire or effort. It's just the challenges that we run into. We cannot go seize a bank account in Hong Kong. We don't have the authority to do that. We have to work with our counterparts in Hong Kong police force who may do it, but they're going to ask a lot of questions first. Well, what's the nature of the scam? How is the person scammed? And by the time we provide all that information, look, the bad guys are really good at what they do. These are not people sitting in their basements just doing this that are a bunch of, teenagers, right? These are cartels, as Dan mentioned. And they're not going to let the money sit in that account. They're going to move it, whether it's cryptocurrency, as you saw from Dan's slide, that peel chain that can be gone in 90 seconds, or if it's US dollars, they can execute wire transfers and split that money into 35 different accounts in 15 different jurisdictions within a couple of days. So unless the victim reports the scam immediately, the chances for success in getting the money back are less than 1%. I will add one thing that we didn't discuss already, which is the FBI through IC3 has an effort called the Financial Fraud Kill Chain. And what the kill chain is a mechanism where we can work with domestic US banks and our international counterparts to seize money of scam proceeds if the wire transfer has happened within 72 hours. So this is entirely contingent on the victim understanding and realizing they're a victim of a scam and then reporting it via IC3 within 72 hours of the date or time of the actual wire transfer itself. If that does happen, then our chances of success are closer to 50% with the relationships we have, not just with US banks, but also with foreign jurisdictions, assuming, of course, it goes to a jurisdiction where we have relations. If it goes to China, we're not going to have any luck whatsoever. But if it goes to Singapore, well, we have pretty good relations with them. They can freeze the account for us.
Well, Brett and Dan, you have been very popular. There's lots of questions left, but we need to proceed with the rest of the presentation, and we could save the questions for later on in the other Q&A. So at this point, I'm going to hand things back to Tracy to introduce today's panelists. Next slide.
Thank you, Laura. Today's panelists are national and local experts on elder financial abuse. You're all familiar with our first panelist, Brett Chabot of the FBI. Next slide. Our next panelist is Tina Patel. Tina is a senior deputy district attorney and has been with the Orange County District Attorney's Office since 2005. She is currently serving in the Major Fraud Elder Financial Fraud Unit and is the assistant head of court. She has performed over 50 jury trials and 20 court trials with experience in misdemeanors, general felonies, sexual assault, juvenile justice, and human trafficking. She also serves as the team captain of OC GRIPE and provides presentations to senior centers on online safety and cyber fraud. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from the University of California in Irvine and a JD from Loyola Law School. Next slide. Our next panelist is Cherie Hill. Cherie has been a police officer with the Anaheim Police Department since 1999. She currently serves as a field training officer. She previously served as a detective specializing in elder and dependent adult abuse with experience in homicide, child sexual assault, and pornography, as well as domestic violence. She has received several awards for her service, including National Crime Victim Service Award, Law Enforcement Elder Abuse Award, and multiple community service awards. Before becoming a police officer, Cherie was a teacher for many years. She holds an Associate of Arts from Fullerton, a Bachelor's of Arts, and a teaching credential from Cal State University of Fullerton. Next slide. And last but not least, we have Maika Bledsoe of Human Options. Maika is a licensed marriage and family therapist and has been with Human Options since 2011. She currently serves as the clinical program supervisor for community-based services and the Safe Options for Seniors program. She is a fierce advocate for victims of elder and dependent adult abuse and domestic violence. She's trained in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and trauma-informed care. She is also trained as a domestic violence and sexual assault counselor. She holds both a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Science in counseling from California State University, Fullerton. Now I will hand it off to Laura, who will direct questions to our panelists. Next slide.
Hello. So this first question I have is for Brett. When should victims of scams or fraud contact the FBI versus contacting their local law enforcement?
Well, I would say I don't want to leave it up to the victim to differentiate. We don't want to put more on them. So I think the short answer is report to both, right? And then we'll work with local law enforcement to figure out where it best makes sense. Is it a federal case? Is it something that should be worked through the DA's office? we can assess that both through local law enforcement relationships as well as our partners at the district attorney's office and at the U.S. attorney's office. So I don't want to send the message, that victims have to report to one or other. I would say report to both, and we'll figure it out. And we periodically meet here in Orange County through kind of like a pseudo task force we have set up. It's really kind of a working group on financial crimes where we meet with folks from Anaheim PD and Irvine Police Department and the Orange County Sheriffs, and even some of the smaller departments here in Orange County. And we bring a pretty large contingent to these meetings that happen about quarterly to talk about the scams that we've seen, what the trends are, how we're going about addressing them. And it's through these conversations and meetings where we develop these relationships and we can figure out where or what the next best investigative step should be.
Okay, so Tina, what are the requirements for the district attorney's office to file criminal charges for financial abuse and fraud?
Hey, well, good morning, everyone. So what are the requirements for us to actually file these charges? Well, we've been talking a lot about the cyber type of crimes. And of course, in those cases, as both I think Brett and Dan mentioned, you can't always find the perpetrator, right? Because they're overseas. So our role really starts when we have found the person who we believe committed the crime. And so we need to show, just as in every other case that we file charges on here, that we can prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. And that doesn't just mean that we can prove the case, by looking at it, reading at it, talking to the witnesses, but that we are confident that we can prove the case in court beyond a reasonable doubt through witnesses, victims, documents, whatever evidence we're able to collect. A lot of these cases, especially any financial fraud case, is going to be document heavy, of course. So we want to ask that when witnesses or investigators are coming to us with these cases, that they've preserved everything, right? So you've kept all of your transaction receipts. Of course, you have your bank records and you can print them. And of course, we will then be able to serve search warrants to get official bank records and things like that. But that everything that you have that shows the financial transaction is there for us to consider, including emails between the parties or, contracts and things that are signed, for example, in an investment case. From there, we look at all the various sections in the penal code. So that includes thefts, embezzlements, forgeries, identity theft, and specifically, of course, in this case, crimes against the elder community or theft against the elder community, which is specifically in penal code sections 368D and E. Within those sections, for us to be able to charge and actually file charges, we have to show the elements of that section. And that is that, one, the defendant committed the theft or embezzlement or forgery or fraud, identity theft, whichever one it is, that the property belonged to the victim and is worth more than $950 in terms of a felony. It can be less for a misdemeanor, and that the defendant knew or reasonably should have known that the owner was an elder or dependent adult. And I think for the purpose of this specific talk, the most important one that I can kind of spend a little time on is really the theft itself, which, as we know, if a crime is a theft, it's because there was lack of consent, right? So you didn't consent to having your money stolen. And that sounds pretty obvious in a lot of these cases, especially if someone just comes into your bank account that you don't know and is moving money around. Obviously, you did not consent to that. But what happens in a lot of the cases where I have elder victims is that can be kind of blurry. And so there's three ways we're going to hope that we can see that through the evidence. And that is, number one, just straight up, like I said, without consent, without the senior person's consent. And then that person would have to be willing and able to come to court and testify and say, I did not give this person consent to take my money. That can be slippery in terms of sometimes you have these cases with like a caretaker or a adult child or somebody like that, where they were allowed to use the credit card to do basic expenses or pay bills, but they weren't allowed necessarily to plan some vacation or eat dinner out every night or pay their own credit card off or pay their child's dental bills or whatever it was. And so we'd have to have the victim able and willing to come to court to say, I did not consent to this item, this item, this item, going through the list in a bank record. The second way is, of course, obtaining consent through theft by trick or false pretense. So we can also show that while you may have consented and given over money, you did it because there was some false pretense that you were given. So this happens a lot in the investment type of scam, right? You got really close to somebody. They said, this is a great investment plan. You're going to make so much money. You give it over. You don't get any return. And then you ask for your money back typically, and it's gone. And then from there, we would have to show evidence of how the money was used. And so we can then get into the bank accounts of the defendant or suspect and see what they did with the money. Did they actually put it in some investment? Did they just go gamble it away? And what was the, was there a contract between the two of you, even if it was verbal, or it's always better if it's on paper, but theft by false pretense is really just that you were told something and then something completely different happened. And then most importantly, I think, or the one that we have the most difficulty with, I would say, I guess, but it's not impossible, is when lack of consent is there because of a lack of capacity. So of course, in our elder population, as you get older, capacity becomes an issue. And so if we can show there's a lack of capacity, well, that invalidates any consent that the person gave to whomever spent their money. So how do we show lack of capacity? And that's where I think it's really important for whoever is reporting these crimes or whoever out there is helping these seniors or their relatives and their friends. We need medical records, right? So if we're going to charge the case based on a lack of capacity, we're going to ask that there are some medical records out there that will tell us what exactly was going on. Was there dementia? Was there Alzheimer's? Sometimes there's a very clean statement by a doctor that says this person cannot consent to financial transactions. And then the perpetrator, whether, like I said, it was a caretaker or a best friend or a new love interest or whomever, knew that and had them consent or asked them for money and did all these things anyway. Now, of course, we don't always have medical records, but we can do new cognitive assessments and see what the capacity of that person is in terms of financial transactions. We have experts that can help us determine that. Of course, it's going to be interesting if we're doing that evaluation now and that crime happened 2 years ago. Can we back extrapolate and show that this was going on before, maybe through other medical records or statements from family members or witnesses about what that person was like, maybe a financial pattern, something like that. And it's important to note that I see a lot of cases where I get the concept of undue influence. And while that can definitely work in a civil standard, and I'm not a civil lawyer, but I know that it's used in the civil world. Unfortunately, in the criminal world, there's a case called People v. Brock, which is basically states that undue influence cannot be used in the criminal setting to show lack of consent. So that's going to be in your cases of like a romance scam or but not a romance scam online, but if like an in-person one where the elder person becomes very close to a new love interest, or it could just be like new neighbor, new best friend, whatever it is. And then that person, while that elder person can consent and doesn't lack any capacity to do that, is influenced by a lot of, false promises or hope for the future and all these things, and gives the money. And then later, the perpetrator probably takes off. And then we're in a position where either that person or family member is saying, hey, this person took advantage of my loved one through undue influence. Yes, they consented. They didn't want to do, they were just very, for lack of a better word, influenced by this person and listened, and they were naive and they took everything, but we're not going to be able to use that in a criminal context. So I'm, in that sense, lack of capacity is only going to be able to come through medical records and things like that. But really, it's just about, like I said, documents and as many witnesses as we can get.
Okay, great. So Tina, what are the most recent fraud trends seen in the district attorney's office targeting older adults?
I'd probably say a lot of the things that Brett and Dan have mentioned. So we are also seeing a lot of cyber scams, and we're seeing them here. Like I said, we're not going to be able to prosecute them if we can't find the person, but we're getting a lot of reports of them constantly. And so we're trying to work with our own investigators to see if we can track some form of money. And like they said, if it's trackable within the United States, we are able to find people, but most of the newer stuff we're seeing is coming through internet scams or getting a weird email and then sending money in that sense. Maybe less and less of the personal type of relationship that I'm seeing, the online scam.
And this last question for you, Tina, is there any way for victims to get money back that they've been scammed out of?
If the money's still there, yes. I think our biggest goal here is to get the money back. If the money is there, our office will, and if it's in a bank account, we will move to freeze it as soon as we can and then get the money back. Also, even if we don't freeze up front, if we prosecute the person, of course, we'll have a restitution order. Again, that doesn't mean they'll pay, but many times we'll negotiate where we're asking them to pay back to, and that can go towards potentially, negotiating a lighter sentence or whatever it is. But yes, it's always, if the money's there, we're going to do everything we can to try to get it back through either, straight asking for it while we're negotiating the case in court or trying to freeze it.
Okay, great. So this next question, set of questions is for Detective Sherry Hill. Should victims report financial abuse to local law enforcement? And if so, what steps are taken after it's been reported?
So like Brett said, absolutely. You're going to report any type of financial abuse to local law enforcement. And in terms of scams, absolutely, both local and FBI. But you're going to report types of financial abuse like Tina was mentioning, fraud, embezzlement, forgery. And something that I really do want to point out that Tina had mentioned was that sometimes a lot of times, these perpetrators or caretakers, they are trusted family members, they're trusted friends, right, that are taking advantage of the elder. So it's really incumbent upon not just the victim themselves, but people around them. So maybe a family member that sees that it monitor a bank account, right? And if you see that this person is being victimized, then make a police report initially on behalf of that elder victim. We are also going to rely on banks and APS workers to look for anything suspicious and make reports. So yeah, scams go to FBI as well as us, but forgery, theft, embezzlement, local law enforcement. So the other big point is you have to make a report immediately. I know people are very reluctant to be victims in these cases for whatever reasons that Micah will talk about next, but we want the victims to come forward and make this report immediately. That allows us to get on the case and possibly, like was mentioned earlier, possibly freezing accounts so we can kind of stop that bleeding. As far as like what steps people are going to take to make that report, you can call patrol response, right? So if you want to make a report, call patrol out. The victim can also go to the front counter. APS, I'm going to ask you guys to also go to the front counter or call a detective and make a police report, not just relying on the fax form that comes through. So you're going to make a report with your local law enforcement. Once that's made, it goes to the economic crimes detail, and that detective sergeant will assign that case to a detective. And as was mentioned earlier, that our caseloads are really high. We do get a lot of cases, and we can't handle every single thing that comes in, unfortunately. But we're going to get search warrants, look for documents. We're going to ask the victim to bring in banks documents, financial documents. We're going to interview witnesses. We're going to look at surveillance. We're going to do anything we can in order to put a case together and package that for the DA.
Okay, great. I have one last question, and that's for Maika. Before we start our poll, what mental health issues arise from victims of elder financial abuse?
Hi, everyone. Yes, so there was a study done that concluded that elder financial mistreatment was associated with significant increased likelihood of depression, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress syndrome, and generalized anxiety disorder, as well as decreased levels of self-care with health, mental health and physical health. And so the important thing to note about this is that something we often see in what in regards to just talking about this, our older adults feel an immense amount of shame and embarrassment when they realize that they've been manipulated and that their money is gone. And so a lot of times they don't want to talk about it or tell anyone. And when they do not do this, that means, like Detective Hill is saying, reports are not made to law enforcement, and we don't find out about it, and which could increase those symptoms of depression, could increase those symptoms of anxiety, especially if left untreated. And so it can be very overwhelming for our older adults when they have to deal with these situations after the fact.
Okay, thank you. And now we're going to go launch into another poll question. Financial abuse does not have a significant impact on victims' mental health. So true or false? Again, quickly answer, please. Financial abuse does not have a significant impact on a victim's mental health. If you're unable to answer the question via the poll, please put your answer into the chat box. A couple more seconds for everyone to answer. Okay, we're going to go ahead and end the poll. Share the results. So great job, everybody. I will now hand it back to our Q&A.
Okay, so we'll resume the Q&A. The next question we have for the panelists is, how can we help a senior who doesn't believe they are being scammed?
Hi, this is Brett. I'm happy to jump in on that one. We run into that routinely, and so I think it's just where we found success is a lot of times having law enforcement speak to the victim. So generally, the kind of how we see this play out is the victim scammed, doesn't believe they're being scammed. A family member, son or daughter, whoever it is, understands now that money is being transferred into cryptocurrency or wire transfers overseas. The family member clearly recognizes it as a scam, tries to convince the victim that this is a scam, and the victim doesn't buy it. So what we've done many times here, and sometimes this comes through Karen in her office, so thanks, Karen. So refer these to us, and we will have somebody, sometimes it's myself, sometimes it's Dan or somebody else on my squad. We'll just reach out to the victim to give kind of that additional voice, especially from the law enforcement perspective, to say, hey, look, I understand you may not think you're being victimized, but let us tell you what we see on a daily basis. Here are the hallmarks of some of the scams. These are the red flags I see in your instance. And then we also let them know that they're not alone. As we know now, right, from the IC3 reporting, that the number of scams out there is significant, right? And so we try to give that kind of second voice to the victim and let them know that they're not alone, that there's literally millions of these victims across the United States.
Great, thank you. Has there been an increase in civil lawsuits that banks or customers have filed against financial institutions due to neglect in these types of fraud situations?
Hi, Brett again. I'm not aware of any. I mean, it's kind of outside of our lane, the civil regulatory realm. I've heard of that some victims have, engaged in many conversations with their financial institutions, and even one that I think it tried to sue Wells Fargo, but that's like a one-off situation, and I don't know if the lawsuit was successful because, again, that's not really our lane. So unfortunately, I can't answer that any better than that.
I can jump into that. It's just kind of the same answer. I have seen that actually. I've heard of that in more recent cases where they also sued the financial institution. Again, I don't do civil, so I don't see it all the time, but it is starting to happen, but I don't know what the results are if people are getting any sort of money back or anything related to suing the bank.
So the next question is, what advice do you have for us as the trusted advisor or professional? Oops. Sorry, I'm going to get back to that. That was accidentally erased. I have the question is, I have an elder client who was scammed through someone who stole her mail. These individuals stole money from her bank account in 2017 and again in 2023. Since they have her address, social security, and other personal information, they continue to target her. Is there anything we can do to prevent this from happening again? Are there programs that can help with those who continue to get scammed through identity fraud? We have reported to local police, APS, bank, and FBI with over $100,000 loss.
Well, I would add on to that to also file or put a fraud alert on your credit report. I don't know if you've done that yet. I had something actually similar happen to me about 2 years ago where I had a new debit card that was sent to my mailing address that was stolen out of my mailbox, and roughly 3 days later that debit card was used to pull out several $100s out of a couple of different ATMs, all of which were approved. So first step, obviously, is to report it to your bank. The bank will conduct an investigation and should reimburse any funds if they're taken from your checking account, right? And it sounds like maybe you've done that. If sounds like it's a repeated activity targeted towards you, I would make sure you have a fraud alert on your account to prevent lines of credit cards being opened on your account. I think if that hasn't been done, that would be my immediate next step.
Do you hear anything about legislation to deter the ability for nefarious actors from spoofing, etc.?
I can talk about that. And the answer is no, I don't. I wish there was legislation out there more geared towards financial crimes, but no, it isn't out. It isn't on the legislation's dockets these days. I'm hoping these kinds of events and the statistics will lead to that. But no, at this time, I haven't heard of legislation about that.
Okay, and are there any supportive services for victims at this point?
In the DA world, of course, we do have a victim witness service, but that's once the case has been filed, and then we can use our victim witness advocates to help support the victims, but that's really for the court process. Prior to that, I think maybe someone else might know better.
Absolutely, Tina, I can speak to that. So our agency and other agencies that help victims of domestic violence, abuse, elder abuse, provide counseling services. Our agency provides individual counseling for victims of elder abuse, as well as legal advocacy, so they can talk to a legal advocate about what has happened, see what their options might be. And then we also have groups. We have support groups and groups that can help them understand what's happening to them or happened, the impact of it, and then learn some new skills, maybe even learn how to set boundaries, just to help make sure something like this doesn't happen again.
Okay, great. So Maika, how do we help victims who have been impacted emotionally due to elder financial abuse?
Yeah, so what's important is really that they know they're supported, and making sure that they have some social supports, as well as being able to talk about it with someone. Like I was saying earlier, if no one knows what's going on and they have to suffer in silence, it makes things worse. So whether that be that they have friends and family members they can reach out to, whether it be that they go to an agency like ours and they get counseling from a therapist, I think even all of those things can be helpful. And then being educated on what happened. A lot of times in our groups, when we have support groups, people think they're the only ones. And so when they're in the support group and they meet other people that these things have happened to, they start to feel supported and realize they're not alone and that this could happen to anyone.
Great. And last question for you, Micah, is what can family or friends do to try to help older victims if they suspect financial abuse?
Yes, that's a great question. And so two things. Once it should be reported. It should be reported so that there are other eyes on it so that they might be able to get some assistance. And so they can report that to their local adult protective services. And then if these things are rising, of course, to a criminal level, report it to law enforcement. And then what's also important is making sure, again, that these victims feel supported and really making sure with our older adults that we're checking on them, that they know we're around. We're not just going to hop in when something happens, but that because the more the likelihood of them telling us what's going on is really because we're around. And when no one is around and they're all alone, that's when these things sometimes happen. And so really just making sure we're a constant in their lives. And so it's easier for them to talk to us. It's easier for them to let us in on a weird phone call or email or something they accidentally clicked on. So really being vigilant, being there and supporting our older adults.
Okay, great. Detective Hill, what types of trends do you see locally in regards to financial elder abuse?
Yeah, I think that was touched on earlier. Basically, you got the fraud, the caretaker abuse, the family abuse, the embezzlement, where, let's say a family member, let's say mom says, okay, hey, can you go cash my SSI and put it or my social security and put it in my account, and then the family member decides, okay, well, while I'm there, why don't I go ahead and scam a little bit off of her, and go get my hair done, things like that. So we see cases like that. I also see identity theft, right? So you've got the dark web where people can go in and grab personal information on all of us, right? And people going in and representing themselves as the victim and buying things from Home Depot, places like that.
Okay, great. And Detective Hill, what should a person do if the older adult is scared or unwilling to stop talking to the scammer?
This is a really tough one, and I think we kind of touched on that, and I think Brett had mentioned it. It takes a lot of us getting together and trying to convince that person that they're okay, but yet they are a victim, and we see this a lot where they don't want to stop. So it takes APS getting together, talking to this person. It takes law enforcement. It takes family members trying to protect them. I mean, we've even gone so far as had family members, like, because a lot of these people have hard lines, right? So we'll have them change their telephone numbers, and somehow these victims will find a way, and the criminals will find a way to recontact them and get that phone number. So it's just a matter of being diligent as far as family members, close friends, and our community, right, of law enforcement and human options of standing by these people. And I would say get somebody to monitor their accounts.
Okay, great. The next question is, what is the statute of limitations to report fraud? And I'm assuming for federal and state.
In terms of the cases for us, it's 4 years from the date of discovery. So not from when it occurred, but we can file a case as long as we have 4 years from the date of discovery of when either the victim figured it out and started reporting it. So for example, in these like caretaker cases, if someone's been with you for the last 8 years and they've been taking money since 2017, 18, 19, but you don't go back and find this out till 2022, because you didn't discover it till then, you should still report right away. Of course, that's the big takeaway, but we have 4 years from the date of discovery to bring charges.
And I'll add on the federal side, generally the statute of limitations on wire fraud and mail fraud, which is usually what we charge in these cases, is 5 years. Now, that being said, it's 5 years from the date of the actual criminal conduct, or I guess the actual wire transfer if we're charging wire fraud. But that being said, there are ways we can work around that through acts in furtherance of the scheme. So let's say a wire transfer happens on a date 5 years ago today. It doesn't mean that the statute ends today if the scammer continued to engage the victim and provide additional lies and misrepresentations following that as he was trying to get more money from the victim. That could all be considered conduct and furtherance of the scheme. And if we can tie in some sort of wire fraud element to that conduct, then the statute will continue to run. So there's ways to work around that.
Great. The next question is, are there any consortiums that share data points such as Money Mules, Wired beneficiaries, or the Stephen Grubbers of the world to help us protect our mutual clients more proactively?
I can start first on this. I'm not aware of one that's out there in general to the public other than open source research. I mean, a lot of victims, in addition to reporting to law enforcement, also take their complaint online to various threads on Reddit, as an example, or to ripoffreport.com is another one that we see. And that's all open source stuff available to the public, anybody with internet access. So at the very least, you could type in a phone number or a scammer's purported name that he's using to see if it surfaces in any complaint that a victim has lodged in a publicly available database. We use on the law enforcement side IC3 a lot because that's where all of this stuff is maintained, and it's a good searching tool for us. But unfortunately, it's only available to law enforcement on the search side. Sorry, not on the complaint side, just when you're searching.
Okay, so the next question is there a website to give to residents about AI? We have a resident who believes young Asian millionaires living in London want to marry them. The pictures look fake.
I don't think we need a website for that. It is fake, 100%. In fact, that is exactly what the stuff that Dan was talking about. I mean, it may be AI generated. It probably is. Some of these scams are now using AI to their advantage. But I would say there's no further investigation that needs to be done there. That is 100% a scam.
Okay, great. Are there any laws, regulations, or obligations on financial institutions to inform clients of scammers who impersonate and spoof financial institutions through telephonic contact?
That's a good question. I'm not aware of any on that side, unfortunately. So that's hard for me to answer.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any either, but I do know that banks are mandated reporters. And so they, at least here in the state of California, they have to report to APS any suspicion of financial abuse. But what I would also ask is that they don't just report to APS, but they also report any suspicion to law enforcement, the local law enforcement agency as well.
Great. So unfortunately, we've run out of time for the Q&A session, and I will be referring the next set of slides to Libby. Next slide, please.
Thank you so much, Laura. And we'd like to thank our presenters and panelists today for their time and the invaluable information they've provided, and also to Radiant Futures for sponsoring our opportunity drawing. I'd also like to personally thank our committee for all of their hard work to make this event possible. And more importantly, we thank all of you for being here today. So I'd like at this point to introduce Kim Nguyen from Orange County Social Services to provide our closing remarks. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Libby. A reminder to everyone, attendees who complete the evaluation at the end of today's event will receive a certifications for continuing education credits and will be entered into an opportunity drawing to receive one of 20 e-gift cards value at $250 each. Again, you must provide your age range to qualify for the opportunity drawing. In addition, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to view recording of today's webinar. Please be sure to share the link. Next slide, please. On behalf of our committees and the presenters, and again, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day. We hope to see you again next year.